Welcome to American Scandal Report by Skoob. I'm your host, Oz Dalton, and today we're diving deep into one of the most controversial and expensive criminal cases in American history. A case that would tear apart families, destroy lives, and expose the dangerous intersection between fear, suggestion, and justice. Picture this: it's 1983 in Manhattan Beach, California. Parents are dropping their children off at what seems like any other preschool, the McMartin Preschool. Little do they know that in just a few short months, this innocent looking building will become ground zero for accusations so shocking, so unthinkable, that they'll grip the entire nation in fear. But here's the thing about the McMartin case: it wasn't just about alleged child abuse, it became something far more sinister and complex. It became about how an entire community could be consumed by panic, how children's memories could be manipulated, and how the very systems designed to protect the innocent could become instruments of destruction. Today, we're going to unpack every twisted detail of this case, from the initial arrest that started it all, to the secret tunnels that may or may not have existed, to the devastating aftermath that left everyone questioning what really happened beneath that preschool. This is the story of how moral panic, media frenzy, and flawed investigative techniques converge to create what many consider the most dangerous witch hunt of the modern era. Our story begins with a single arrest and one catastrophic decision by the Los Angeles Police Department. On September 7th, 1983, Ray Buckey, an employee at Virginia McMartin's preschool, was arrested on suspicion of child molestation. But here's where things take a turn that would define the entire case. Instead of conducting a careful, methodical investigation, the police did something that would contaminate every piece of evidence that followed. They sent out a letter, not just any letter, but a form letter to approximately 200 families whose children attended the preschool. And the contents of this letter were, frankly, shocking in their bluntness and leading nature. Let me read you exactly what parents received in their mailboxes. This department is conducting a criminal investigation involving child molestation. Ray Buckey, an employee of Virginia McMartin's preschool, was arrested on September 7th, 1983 by this department. The following procedure is obviously unpleasant, but to protect the rights of your children as well as the rights of the accused, this inquiry is necessary for a complete investigation. But then it gets worse. The letter continues: please question your child to see if he or she has been a witness to any crime or if he or she has been a victim. Our investigation indicates that possible criminal acts include oral sex, fondling of genitals, buttocks or chest area, and sodomy, possibly committed under the pretense of taking the child's temperature. Imagine being a parent and receiving this letter about your child's school. The panic was immediate and widespread. Parents began frantically questioning their children, and then, crucially, they began talking to each other, comparing notes, sharing fears, and unknowingly contaminating potential evidence. Kenneth Lanning, who worked with the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit and consulted on the McMartin investigation, would later make a chilling observation. Once such cases are contaminated in this way, it becomes nearly impossible to determine with certainty what actually happened. The LAPD had essentially poisoned their own well of evidence before the investigation had even begun. Soon, emotionally invested parents were engaging in leading and suggestive questioning of their own children. Picture 3 and 4-year-olds being repeatedly asked about concepts they barely understood by parents who were terrified and desperately seeking answers. The stage was set for a perfect storm of false memories, suggestion, and collective hysteria. As hundreds of panicked parents contacted the LAPD, many complained about the blunt, traumatic approach investigators were taking when questioning their children. The Los Angeles District Attorney's Office needed a solution, and they found it in the Children's Institute International, a private therapy center with what seemed like a solid reputation. Enter Key McFarlane, the social worker who would become the most controversial figure in the entire McMartin saga. McFarlane was tasked with interviewing the children, and what emerged from those interviews would shock the nation and fuel years of legal battles. During these sessions, children began recounting extraordinary and extraordinarily disturbing stories. They spoke of sexual abuse, orgies in car washes, and a complex system of tunnels and hidden chambers beneath the school where they were allegedly assaulted. Several children described something called the naked movie star game, where they claimed they were photographed nude. These stories were leaked to the public through a single reporter at the local ABC affiliate, who began broadcasting shocking reports that sent waves of terror through the community. Parents were horrified, the media was captivated, and the public demanded justice. But here's what wasn't widely reported at the time: information that would later prove crucial to understanding what really happened. McFarlane had obtained these descriptions through the use of anatomically correct dolls and highly leading questions. Even more troubling, it wasn't disclosed that McFarlane and that ABC reporter were romantically involved. A massive conflict of interest that would taint the entire narrative being presented to the public. The children's accounts grew increasingly bizarre. Some claimed they had been flushed down toilets to secret rooms where they were assaulted and then mysteriously returned to their parents without anyone noticing. Others described being taken on airplane rides to distant locations for abuse. These stories, rather than raising red flags about the interview techniques being used, were instead seen as evidence of a house of horrors operating beneath the innocent facade of a preschool. What's most disturbing when you read the interview transcripts today is how the therapists, likely unintentionally, coerced children into fabricating stories of abuse. Children as young as 3 were subjected to repeated questioning, often under intense pressure to provide the right answers. When children initially denied anything had happened, saying they had never played naked games or been hurt, they were met with persistence until they eventually gave the interviewers what they wanted to hear. As the McMartin case gained national attention, something even more sinister began to emerge from the collective unconscious of 1980s America: widespread fear of satanic ritual abuse. The McMartin allegations weren't happening in isolation. They were part of a broader moral panic that was sweeping across the United States. Reports of satanic ritual abuse began spreading through the mental health community like wildfire. Nationwide, FBI agents, police officers, lawyers, and social workers gathered at conferences and seminars to share their findings. They distributed what they called satanic calendars, pamphlets about occult symbols, like the Cross of Nero and the Horned Hand, and lists of alleged occult organizations. These organizations were claimed to be led by secretive, powerful elites who supposedly abducted or bred children for sacrifice, pornography, or prostitution. The narrative was terrifying and compelling: hidden networks of evil operating right under our noses, preying on the most innocent members of society. At the same time, reports began emerging of satanic cults forming in small towns across America, places like Childress, Texas, allegedly working to corrupt children and undermine God-fearing communities. The McMartin case had become the flagship example of this supposed epidemic of ritualistic child abuse. What made this panic so powerful was how it tapped into deep-seated fears that already existed in American society. The 1980s were a time of rapid social change, increasing numbers of working mothers, and growing reliance on daycare centers. Parents were already anxious about leaving their children in the care of strangers, and the McMartin case seemed to validate their worst nightmares. The media coverage was relentless and sensationalized. News programs featured dramatic reenactments, expert interviews about satanic symbols, and heart-wrenching testimony from parents convinced their children had been victimized. The public was horrified, fascinated, and hungry for more details about these alleged underground networks of abuse. But here's what's crucial to understand. Despite all the conferences, all the expert testimonies, and all the widespread fear, investigators never found concrete evidence of these supposed satanic networks. No animal carcasses were discovered, no ritual sites were uncovered, and no credible evidence of organized satanic activity was ever presented in court. Perhaps no aspect of the McMartin case has generated more debate and controversy than the question of what, if anything, was actually beneath the preschool building. The children's testimonies consistently included descriptions of being led through trapdoors in classroom floors, down into tunnels beneath the building, and emerging in secret rooms where horrific acts supposedly occurred. When law enforcement initially examined the preschool grounds, they conducted limited searches that were mostly confined to the surrounding lot rather than penetrating the concrete slab floor of the building itself. Their conclusion was definitive. No secret chambers or tunnels existed beneath the preschool. This official finding became a cornerstone for those who viewed the allegations as products of suggestion and mass hysteria. But the story doesn't end there. In May 1990, after the building had largely ceased being treated as an active crime scene and was scheduled for demolition, something extraordinary happened. A privately commissioned archaeological team led by E. Gary Stickle undertook a much more extensive excavation. This investigation was far more thorough than the initial police searches. The team cut through the concrete foundation and employed ground penetrating radar and other sophisticated geophysical methods. And what they claimed to find was shocking. According to their executive summary, they unearthed not one but two tunnel complexes beneath the structure. The team reported discovering inexplicable structural features, including upright containers placed in cavities and a fill system that suggested the tunnels had been deliberately backfilled after use. Most remarkably, they claimed that one of the tunnel features conformed closely to the children's descriptions, not just in general route, but in specific structural details. However, this discovery immediately became mired in controversy. Critics pointed out significant problems with the findings. The fill material inside the alleged tunnels included debris and artifacts from before the preschool's construction, suggesting these might have been old trash pits, utility conduits, or simply construction fill voids rather than secret passageways. Others argued that the excavation methodology was flawed and that the fact the project was privately funded by parents of the alleged victims introduced serious biases. For many investigators and scholars, the absence of corroborating structural evidence, things like proper shoring, tunnel lining, or convincing utility markings, weakened the claim that these were functional tunnels used for the activities described by the children. So what's the truth? The reality is that we may never know for certain. There appear to have been anomalous subsurface features at the preschool site, voids, fill zones, old utilities, or pits that could be interpreted as tunnels by some observers. But whether these features were actually used for the activities alleged, or whether they match the extraordinary claims of ritual abuse, remains unproven and hotly debated to this day. With the media circus reaching fever pitch and public demand for justice growing louder, the case finally moved into the courtroom, where it would become the longest and most expensive criminal trial in American history. Leading the prosecution was Lael Rubin, a seasoned attorney known for her tenacity and unwavering belief in the accusations against the McMartins. She was convinced she was fighting for justice for dozens of abused children. Facing her was Dean Gitz, a skilled defense lawyer who found himself in the unenviable position of defending clients accused of unthinkable crimes against children. His task was to prove that his clients were innocent victims of mass hysteria and flawed investigative techniques. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the children's testimonies, and those testimonies were indeed harrowing. Child after child took the stand and described horrific acts of abuse in disturbing detail. For many observers, the emotional impact of these testimonies was overwhelming. How could so many children be lying about such specific acts of violence and degradation? But the defense had a different theory entirely. They argued that these memories had been shaped and distorted by the suggestive interview techniques we discussed earlier, combined with the pervasive atmosphere of fear and expectation that had consumed the community. They contended that the children weren't lying. They genuinely believed these events had happened, but that their memories had been artificially created through repeated questioning and suggestion. The trial dragged on for 6 grueling years, testing the limits of the justice system and the emotional resilience of everyone involved. Expert witnesses on both sides offered contradictory opinions on the reliability of child testimony, the validity of recovered memories, and the nature of child sexual abuse itself. The jury found themselves overwhelmed by complex and often conflicting information. As the proceedings continued, cracks began to appear in the prosecution's case. Inconsistencies emerged in the children's testimonies when they were cross-examined. The questionable interview techniques became a major focus of the defense strategy. And perhaps most damaging of all, despite years of investigation and millions of dollars spent, prosecutors had been unable to produce any physical evidence to corroborate the children's claims. Remember, these weren't allegations of simple abuse. The children had described elaborate rituals, animal sacrifices, photographic evidence, and systematic torture. Yet investigators found no pornography, no animal remains, no photographs, no bodily fluids, and no physical signs of the extreme abuse that had been described in such vivid detail. The defense argued that the McMartins were victims of a witch hunt fueled by media sensationalism, parental fear, and prosecutorial overzealousness. They painted a picture of a community that had lost its collective mind, consuming innocent people in its hunger for someone to blame for its darkest fears. In 1990, after years of testimony, countless expert witnesses, and over $16 million in taxpayer money, the jury finally delivered their verdict. The moment that would determine the fate of the McMartin family had arrived, but the conclusion was far from the dramatic resolution the public had been expecting. Ray Buckey, who had spent 5 years in jail awaiting trial, 5 years of his life lost to accusations that may never have had any basis in reality, was acquitted on 52 of 65 counts. On the remaining charges, the jury was deadlocked, unable to reach a unanimous decision. Peggy McMartin Buckey, who had endured years of legal battles and public scorn, was acquitted on all charges against her. The McMartin Preschool trial, which had captivated and horrified the nation for nearly a decade, ended not with vindication for the alleged victims or dramatic justice for the accused, but with a quiet, ambiguous resolution that satisfied almost no one. But for the McMartin family, the legal victory was hollow. They emerged from the trial irrevocably scarred, their lives permanently altered by nearly a decade of accusations, media scrutiny, and public vilification. Their reputations were tarnished, their personal relationships fractured, and their legacy forever tied to one of the most sensationalized and controversial cases in American legal history. Virginia McMartin, the elderly founder of the preschool, had watched her life's work destroyed and her family torn apart by accusations she insisted were completely false. Peggy McMartin Buckey, steadfast in maintaining her innocence throughout the ordeal, found herself emotionally and financially drained, struggling to rebuild a life that had been completely derailed. Ray Buckey, who had borne the brunt of the most serious allegations, retreated from public life entirely. The young man who had once worked with children as a calling found himself seeking anonymity and the chance to heal from years of imprisonment, constant scrutiny, and the psychological weight of being accused of horrific crimes he maintained he never committed. The emotional scars ran deep for everyone involved. Years in jail, relentless media attention, and the weight of public hatred had left the family profoundly affected. Even after their legal vindication, they continued to face suspicion and hostility from some community members who remained convinced of their guilt despite the jury's verdict. While the McMartin family was dealing with the immediate aftermath of the trial, serious questions were being raised about the investigative techniques that had fueled the entire case. At the center of this scrutiny was the Children's Institute International and the methods used to interview the alleged victims. The therapists at CII had been convinced they knew the truth from early in the investigation. Based on their videotaped interviews, they reported that more than 90% of the 400 preschoolers they interviewed exhibited signs of sexual abuse. This statistic was staggering and seemed to provide compelling evidence for the prosecution's case. But when the interview techniques were examined more closely, a disturbing picture emerged. The therapists encouraged children to use anatomically correct dolls to demonstrate what had happened, asking leading questions like, "Mr. Parrott, can you help Susie show us what happened to her?" While these techniques may have been well-intentioned, they were capable of creating false memories that could become permanent in young minds. One observer noted something particularly telling. "We have heard it 100 times or more from children. The same things, the same games, the same descriptions. I can't recall ever seeing a videotape where kids spontaneously said, 'This happened to me,' on their own." This observation highlights a crucial point. The children weren't spontaneously reporting abuse. They were providing information only after specific questioning and prompting. The interviews are difficult to read even today because of how unintentionally the therapists appeared to coerce children into fabricating stories of abuse. Children as young as 3 or 4 were subjected to repeated questioning sessions, often under pressure to provide the right answers. When children initially denied that anything had happened, such as saying they had never played any naked games, they were met with persistent, repeated questioning until they eventually conformed to what the interviewer wanted to hear. Dr. Stephen Ambrose, who was at CII during the McMartin interviews, later reflected on the situation with a mixture of defensiveness and acknowledgement of problems. He noted that while therapists initially tried to be careful, their growing conviction that abuse had occurred likely led to some leading questions. He also contextualized the case within the emerging understanding of child sexual abuse at the time. The McMartin case came about just as a new understanding of child sexual abuse was emerging, Ambrose explained. Back then, society was only beginning to come to terms with the fact that child sexual abuse was real People didn't want to believe young children had been molested. They preferred to deny it. Once upon a time, we were the children, and nobody believed us. This context is important for understanding how the case developed. The investigators and therapists weren't malicious. They were operating in an environment where society was just beginning to acknowledge the reality of child sexual abuse, and they may have overcorrected in their determination to believe and protect children. However, as Kenneth Lanning from the FBI observed, belief alone could not substitute for evidence, and once such cases become contaminated by suggestive questioning, determining the truth becomes nearly impossible. The McMartin Preschool case didn't just end with the verdict, its impact rippled through American society for decades, fundamentally changing how we approach child abuse investigations, understand memory and suggestion, and think about moral panic in modern society. For the legal and investigative communities, McMartin became a watershed moment that prompted significant reforms. Interview techniques were completely overhauled and standardized to avoid the suggestive practices that had dominated the case. The courts and social services learned hard lessons about how videotaped interviews, repeated questioning, and therapist led narratives could unintentionally coerce children into providing fabricated accounts. The case highlighted the absolute necessity of corroborating physical evidence before pursuing criminal charges in child abuse cases. It helped establish best practices for child witness testimony and forensic interviews that are still used today. In essence, the McMartin case taught the criminal justice system how not to conduct such investigations. But the impact extended far beyond procedural changes. The case played a central role in shaping public perception of child sexual abuse, particularly allegations of ritualistic abuse. Prior to McMartin, reports of organized satanic abuse in daycare settings were rare and often dismissed. Afterward, the case fueled a national wave of suspicion toward preschools, daycare centers, and caregivers that resulted in widespread fear and, tragically, false accusations in other communities across the country. Scholars, psychologists, and law enforcement officers began examining how suggestive questioning, leading interviews, and social reinforcement could produce false memories in children. This contributed to our modern understanding of what became known as memory contamination, how external suggestions can create vivid, detailed memories of events that never actually occurred. In popular culture and academic discourse, the McMartin case became the definitive cautionary tale of mass hysteria, moral panic, and media sensationalism. Television specials, books, and movies, most notably Oliver Stone's 1995 TV film Indictment, The McMartin Trial, kept the story alive in public consciousness and reinforced awareness of both the danger of false allegations and society's ongoing fascination with hidden evil. The case continues to be studied by scholars as an archetype of how psychological, social, and legal systems can interact to amplify fear, distort reality, and inflict tremendous harm on innocent people. It serves as a reminder of the thin line between vigilance and hysteria, between protecting children and destroying lives through false accusations. Perhaps most paradoxically, the aftermath of the McMartin case simultaneously raised awareness about child sexual abuse while demonstrating the catastrophic consequences of flawed investigative practices and social panic. It reshaped legal protocols, informed psychological research on suggestibility and memory, and served as a lasting warning about the delicate balance between protecting children and safeguarding the rights of the accused. The McMartin case wasn't about tunnels or cults, it was about fear. No proof of satanic abuse was ever found, yet lives were destroyed, reputations ruined, and trust shattered. What began as an investigation to protect children spiraled into one of America's most haunting moral panics. The children weren't villains, they were victims of suggestion, shaped by leading questions and collective hysteria. The McMartin family, too, paid the price for a crime that never happened. But the real horror? It didn't hide underground. It unfolded in courtrooms, newsrooms, and living rooms where fear drowned out truth. What if the monsters we fear most are the ones we create ourselves? Discover how mass panic rewrote reality and the chilling lessons it still holds today. Download the Skoob app now to hear the full story.